So will the Rolex AD network be phased out in favor of Rolex taking sales in-house and potentially regaining control over some of the rather shonky ADs that are out there? Not all ADs are bad, but some certainly can be. There have been some recent suggestions that this might be the case. A recent article in the Australian Financial Review has suggested that the former Australasian head of Rolex is going to set up his own retail store, and potentially this will be a flagship store in Melbourne, and maybe this will be a sign of things to come in terms of Rolex trying to rein in control over the AD network that already exists. Now, I have no monopoly on ideas about this. I have a finance PhD and I'm an angel investor, so I do follow the business aspect of this. But if you have any thoughts about it, do let me know that in the comments below. And I certainly know that Paul Thorpe, the watch dealer, has been predicting that Rolex is going to do something about ADs for quite some time, and has reported extensively about some of the shenanigans that ADs get up to. Obviously, not all ADs are bad actors, but there's a number that are that give the rest a bad name. So with this preamble out of the way, let's have a look at the AFR article, and we can go from there. And if you have any thoughts about it, definitely let me know those in the comments below. So here we are in the Australian Financial Review. Now, to give you some idea about the quality of this, for people who aren't in Australia, the Australian Financial Review has historically been one of the bigger financial press outlets in Australia, somewhat analogous to Wall Street Journal. It has, however, significantly declined recently in quality. It seems because they're outsourcing a number of their journalists, potentially cutting costs, and a lot of their reporting recently is kind of a bit trashy. But in any case, they are still credible. So what it says here is why Rolex's Australian head decided to run a watch shop instead. Now, this article has rather a lot of waffle about, as you can tell from the picture, yacht racing. I'm going to skip over all of that because I am not in any way interested in yachts. So it says here, to the observer, casual or otherwise, Paul Boutellier, apologies for the pronunciation, had the dream job as the Australasian head of Rolex, the world's best known and most successful watch brand, one that accounts for a quarter of the entire Swiss industry's annual turnover. Swiss-born Boutellier arrived in Australia 10 years ago and had seen the brand through year-on-year stellar success, launching its first local monobrand boutiques, negotiating the purchase of a new head office in Melbourne, and steadying the ship during COVID-19. His success was hardly surprising, given the watch business was in his blood, with first his grandparents, then his parents working in the industry. Now, as an aside, I'll just note here that that does not really mean anything. It's like saying, oh, my grandfather was a lawyer, and my father was a lawyer, therefore I'm going to be a good lawyer, or whatever. It doesn't mean that much, but anyway, it makes for good copy, I guess. Then continuing on, it says, what was surprising was the call from head office on Geneva's Rue Froissart du Sard. Again, apologies about pronunciation. Rolex CEO Jean-Frédéric Dufour told Boutellier it was time to relocate to Switzerland. COVID-19 permitting, a new man would be en route to run Australia. And could Boutellier prepare for the transition? If he was shocked by this turn of events, Boutellier doesn't betray it in his retelling. 8 months have now passed, and we're ensconced in the boardroom of the Cruising Yacht Club of Australia, where he's well known thanks to Rolex's long-time sponsorship of the Sydney to Hobart yacht race. And his focus is on a rather different future. There's just a farewell dinner in Sydney and a day more in the Melbourne office, and Patrick Boutellier will no longer be a Rolex employee, but a retail partner. After rejecting the missive to return to Europe and considering other alternatives, he's reached an altogether different agreement, namely as an operator of a Rolex flagship boutique set to open in Melbourne's Collins Street before Christmas. It's a move. It's a move Boutellier describes as life going full circle. Not that he expected to find himself in the retail business. I was very clear that I wanted to have a corporate role. I grew up in a watchmaking family, a tradition that goes back to my grandfather. He opened his own store in 1934 and was running that over the years with my grandmother, while Dad was a watchmaker in Geneva at Rolex in 1967. That's where he met my mother, and I was born in 1970 in La Salle, and my parents were living in La Chaux-de-Fonds. So, leading on to the store-related issues, it says, Boutellier found himself canvassing local options, from other watch groups to the car and hospitality industries. He also remained in discussions with Dufour the possibility of opening a boutique, and this came up in conversation with no conclusion. Nothing happened for a long time. Then he proposed that I run the flagship, which was amazing. To make that step to the other side and become a retailer, I have to say I'm very excited for 3 reasons. First of all, to be able to stay in the industry, which I love. Secondly, to stay with the brand I love. Thirdly, to open my own business, which can be an opportunity for the future of my family. As for the wherewithal to take such a step, industry insiders variously put the figure at 5 to 6 million Australian dollars to set up and stock a boutique. Bertelier describes it as a massive financial commitment. I had some sleepless nights, but I'm a firm believer that if a decision keeps you awake at night, it's the right decision, because that means you think about it and you think about all the eventualities. I am not sure about that one. I've had deals that I have had quasi-sleepless nights over that fell over that I was happy about, but that's another issue. Anyway, his aim is to create a welcoming destination where we can share his passion for watches. We're working already on the details, how the shop will look. It's a heritage building, and the whole ground floor is going to be a real experience, with a VIP area and an exhibition area on the first floor, a service center on the top floor. The store is going to be world-class. He acknowledges this will put him up against Rolex retailers he's had some familiarity with and control over the past decade, particularly in relation to stock allocation. That was definitely part of the role. But for me, what's very, very important is everything is going to be dealt with at arm's length. And from a brand perspective, my contact now is here in Australia. That's a gentleman who's running the brand here. Bertelier believes he will be treated equally, and that's something that I would want. I won't have an advantage when dealing with Geneva. I will be playing it very fair. I believe in the long term you need integrity, and that's very important to me. As for the reaction of his new cohort, he says, in general, they have been really nice to me. They congratulated me because it's something that has never happened before. That somebody in such a position is going to become a retailer. But then, I have to be realistic as well. They obviously see me as a competitor. So that is our little blurb about what's happening with Rolex here. Rolex having its former Australasian head, opening up a flagship store. Now, there's a few things we need to be clear about. This flagship store appears not to be owned by or run directly by Rolex. However, it does appear to be a store where Rolex is having some input into its establishment. Furthermore, it's a mono-brand store, so there will be no other brands. This means that while he would be a separate dealer, i.e. a separate AD effectively, it's going to be a single brand here as compared to it being in addition to other brands within a store. Furthermore, it appears that Rolex wants at least a degree of control over it, at least if in part because it's a one-brand store. In some ways, this is reminiscent of the mono-brand stores that exist in Sydney, in Australia, where they opened up one of their largest stores in Pitt Street in Sydney. And it doesn't have much stock, but nevertheless, it exists and it's nice enough to be in there. And it would indicate Rolex taking a degree of control over the branding of these stores. So the question firstly is, what does this mean for ADs going forward? Will Rolex phase out ADs? My answer to this is probably not in the immediate term, and there's a few reasons for it. Firstly, Rolex is unlikely to want to establish its own in-house stores. This is because Rolex would then be shifting from a manufacturer to someone that has to keep control of retail. Retail is notoriously a little bit more fickle, i.e. you're subject to lockdowns, you're subject to staff expenses, there's a whole lot of fixed expenses. There are a whole lot of additional things that add up to your costs that make it a little bit more precarious as a business proposition than just manufacturing watches. So it suggests they probably don't have that much appetite to move in-house in terms of selling things. That said, they appear to have an appetite for taking greater control over the dealers, as indicated by the greater emphasis on single brand dealers within Sydney, for example, and now also within Melbourne. So we're seeing a greater emphasis on moving away from all of those myriad ADs and moving more toward single brand controlled store experiences. That would be my interpretation of this. And like I said, there can be good business reasons for this due to the difficulties of and expenses associated with running a retail store. Hence why we'd be seeing that move. And we've seen this echoed in other markets as well. So end of ADs, probably not in the immediate future. Greater control, probably yes. The question, of course, would be, will they phase out ADs? So now instead of selling stock to dealers, they're only going to push it through into their flagship stores that they have direct control over. To my mind, that A, won't create much difference from existing ADs, because then you're just replacing one type of AD with another type of AD, and shonky practices could still exist. So that's the first thing we need to bear in mind here. But I can see Rolex potentially trying to do this if they feel as if the ADs are creating brand-related problems. And if Rolex is having enough problems with ADs, they could easily try to do this. Probably the model they do this with is taking a established AD, so in Sydney, the Hourglass or something along those lines, or someone with a lot of credibility and saying, run this store for us, and then make this the monobrand flagship store. I can see that being the one that is more likely to happen in the short term. Rolex might at some point try to open up their own stores, but at the moment that does not appear to be happening. And the one I mentioned in Sydney was only opened very recently. So definitely, at least now still, they're still partnering with other organizations to establish these stores. So in the immediate term, ADs still are going to exist. The second question is, if ADs were to cease to exist, would this make any difference for people buying from the dealer? In my opinion, it would make a little difference, but only marginal. It will reduce a number of the shady and shonky shenanigans that have gone on. So, for example, the situations where there have been retailers who are demanding above market prices. That is likely to be stamped out or significantly reduced if Rolex takes control over the stores. However, what is unlikely to be reduced is the issue getting stock. Supply is what it is, demand is what it is. Taking all of the sales within the store is not going to influence that at all. So you're still going to get the supply-demand imbalance that exists. What you will avoid, however, is ADs selling watches to their friends, or ADs having weird, opaque preferential lists, or ADs basically forcing you to buy some other brand in order for you to get access to a Rolex, which is not necessarily something Rolex wants. Rolex might want the supply-demand issue, but they probably don't want the issue of you have to go and buy a Panerai that you don't want in order to get access to a Rolex, or you have to go and buy some jewelry you don't want to get a Rolex. They probably don't want that. So they're probably going to have some good reasons for wanting to get greater control. And it would improve the experience as a buyer in general terms by stamping out some of the bad practices, but probably won't dramatically reduce or make it easier for you to get access to stock. Next question is, would this make any difference to the secondary market or the resale market? My answer is this, probably not. In that supply and demand is what it is. If demand keeps up and supply is what it is, then the secondary market is still going to be what it is. So I can still see people selling these things for a profit. I personally have no problem with that, but I'm in business, I'm in finance. People going out and make money, it's what people do. And if supply is different from demand, then the law of supply and demand means you're going to get this price differential. In any case, that's what I would expect to happen or not happen to the resale market. So to wrap this up, is Rolex taking the sales in-house? Well, not technically and not immediately. It appears they're trying to establish greater control over the branding. It appears they're trying to move more toward flagship stores and mono-brand stores and potentially get greater control over how things are sold. And this, to some extent, would be to try to rein in some of the issues that have been happening. But like I said, they don't appear to be shifting fully in-house. Even that flagship store in Sydney would need to send its watches to Rolex for servicing. So it's not as if there's a service center on premises, for example, and that was established recently. So we're seeing some subtle moves, subtle changes to retail to my mind, but it's not going to be whole-scale changes, and I don't necessarily see the Rolex ADs disappearing immediately. Rather, I see Rolex trying to restructure how the sales experience operates and to get greater control over it to avoid bad practices going forward and potentially to try to establish a greater brand presence with flagship retail stores, even if those stores are ultimately run by a separate party. So those are my overall thoughts about what's happening, my thoughts about the Australasian Head opening up a retail store in Melbourne, why I think it's going to have minimal difference on the sales experience, even if Rolex is trying to avoid some of the bad practices that have gone on in the past. Now, if you have any thoughts about what's happened here specifically, or any thoughts about the future of ADs for Rolex, do let me know. Otherwise, it would be great if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you for future videos as well. Bye.